The winter sun was just beginning to set as Flight 257 prepared for its evening departure from San Francisco International Airport. The first-class cabin buzzed with the usual pre-flight activity. Business people tucking away their laptops, flight attendants helping with carry-on bags, and the soft murmur of conversations floating through the air. Among the passengers was a man in his early 40s, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit that spoke of quiet confidence rather than flashy wealth. As the CEO of one of Silicon Valley's fastest-growing tech companies, he was used to spending countless hours in the air, turning these metal tubes into his second office. His company had recently made headlines for its groundbreaking work in sustainable technology, though he preferred letting his work speak louder than his title. The familiar routine of boarding was interrupted when a senior flight attendant, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and her uniform pressed to perfection, stopped abruptly at his seat. Her eyes darted between his face and his seat number, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to poorly concealed suspicion. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying just a bit too loudly across the cabin, "I believe there might be some confusion. This is the first-class cabin." She emphasized each word as if speaking to someone who might not understand English well, despite his American accent. The CEO looked up from his phone, where he'd been reviewing quarterly reports. He'd encountered this scene before, too many times to count. The same assumptions, the same coded language, the same dance of having to prove he belonged in spaces where people who looked like him weren't expected to be. "No confusion at all," he replied calmly, reaching for his boarding pass. The paper was crisp and clear, showing seat 2A, exactly where he was sitting. But even as he held it out, the flight attendant's expression didn't change. She took the boarding pass between two fingers, examining it with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for counterfeit currency. Around them, the cabin had grown quieter. Other passengers were pretending not to watch, but their sideways glances and uncomfortable shifts in their seats told a different story. A young woman in the row behind had stopped mid-sentence in her phone conversation, her eyes wide as she witnessed the scene unfolding. "I'll need to verify this with my supervisor," the flight attendant announced, still holding the boarding pass as if it might bite her. Her voice carried that special tone of authority that some people use when they're certain they've caught someone breaking the rules. The CEO felt a familiar weight settle in his chest, not anger, not exactly, but a deep, tired recognition. In boardrooms and high-end restaurants, at valet stands and country clubs, this scene had played out so many times it almost felt scripted. But each time, he had chosen to respond not with the anger that bubbled beneath the surface, but with something else entirely. He reached into his briefcase, his movements unhurried and deliberate. The leather portfolio he pulled out contained not just his business cards, but also a copy of last month's Business Weekly, where his company's latest innovation had made the cover story. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The flight attendant's face began to change as she glimpsed the magazine cover, then his company ID, then the business cards that marked him as not just any passenger, but one of the most successful tech entrepreneurs in the country. The silence in the cabin had grown thick enough to cut with a knife. Other passengers were no longer pretending not to watch. Some had their phones out, recording the interaction, their expressions a mix of disbelief and discomfort. This moment was about to become more than just another uncomfortable pre-flight interaction. It was about to transform into something none of them expected. The flight attendant's face flushed red as she stared at the evidence before her. The magazine cover, the business cards, the company ID. They all told a story that completely contradicted her assumptions. But instead of offering an immediate apology, she doubled down, her voice taking on an even more condescending tone. "Well," she said, drawing out the word, "we still need to follow proper procedures. These days, anyone can make fancy business cards." She glanced meaningfully at other passengers, as if inviting them to join her skepticism. The CEO noticed an elderly man in the window seat shaking his head disapprovingly, not at him, but at the flight attendant's behavior. The tension in the first-class cabin had become almost unbearable. A businesswoman 3 rows back had set aside her laptop and was openly recording the interaction on her phone. Another passenger was already typing furiously on his phone, likely sharing the story on social media. The quiet hum of the plane's engines seemed to grow louder in the uncomfortable silence. "I've been flying first class on this airline for over 15 years, the CEO said, his voice remaining steady and calm. He pulled out his airline membership card showing his elite status. "I'd be happy to show you my driver's license as well, though I'm curious. Have you asked any other passengers in first class to provide this much documentation?" His question hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, knowing they had simply walked on board, shown their boarding passes once, and been welcomed with warm smiles. A young tech professional across the aisle, who had been watching the entire scene unfold, cleared his throat nervously. "Actually," the young man spoke up, "I only showed my boarding pass when I got on. Nobody asked me for anything else." His voice was shaky but determined. Other passengers began to nod in agreement, some finding their voices too. The flight attendant's professional demeanor cracked slightly. She looked around the cabin, suddenly aware that the situation had shifted. The passengers weren't just watching anymore, they were witnessing, and many were documenting. Her hands, still clutching the CEO's boarding pass, trembled slightly. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding," she attempted, but her voice had lost its earlier authority. She knew she had crossed a line, but pride kept her from admitting it outright. "I'm just trying to ensure everyone is in their assigned seats." "I understand," the CEO replied, his voice taking on a tone that he often used in difficult board meetings. Firm, but not unkind. "You're doing your job, but sometimes our ideas about who belongs where can cloud our judgment, don't you think?" The question wasn't accusatory, it was an invitation to reflect. A few passengers nodded thoughtfully. The flight attendant's face showed a flicker of understanding, maybe even shame, but she quickly masked it with a tight smile. "I'll need to speak with my supervisor," she announced, though her voice had lost its earlier conviction. As she turned to leave, she nearly bumped into another flight attendant who had been watching the scene unfold from the galley. This second flight attendant, who had clearly seen everything, stepped forward with an apologetic smile. "Sir, can I get you something to drink while we sort this out? Perhaps some water or coffee?" The contrast in treatment was stark and obvious to everyone watching. The CEO accepted the offer with a gracious nod, but his mind was already working on something bigger than this single incident. He pulled out his phone and began composing an email to his executive team. This moment of humiliation could become something more, a catalyst for change, a teaching moment that could reach far beyond this airplane cabin. But first, he had to handle the immediate situation with the same grace and dignity that had helped him build his company from the ground up. Around him, the first-class cabin buzzed with whispered conversations. This flight was about to become much more than just another trip from San Francisco to New York. It was about to turn into a story that would make people rethink their own biases and assumptions. The first-class cabin had become an unexpected stage, with every passenger playing their part in this unfolding drama. Some pulled out their phones discreetly, while others watched with undisguised interest. A middle-aged woman in a business suit was already posting the incident on her social media, her fingers flying across her phone screen as she described what she was witnessing. "This is absolutely unacceptable," whispered one passenger to another. "I've never shown more than my boarding pass, and I fly this route every week." The murmurs of agreement spread through the cabin like ripples in a pond. The young tech professional who had spoken up earlier caught the CEO's eye and gave him a supportive nod. He pulled out his business card and leaned across the aisle. "I work for a company that might be interested in partnering with yours," he said quietly. "The way you're handling this situation, it says a lot about your leadership style." Meanwhile, A flight attendant from economy class had heard about the commotion and came to investigate. She immediately recognized the CEO from a recent business magazine and looked horrified at what was happening. She rushed back to inform her colleagues, and soon word spread through the entire plane crew about who they had treated so poorly. The original flight attendant returned with her supervisor, a man with graying temples and a concerned expression. He had clearly been briefed about the situation, and his face showed he understood the gravity of what had transpired. The supervisor's approach was completely different: respectful, apologetic, professional. "Sir, I want to personally apologize for any inconvenience or discomfort you've experienced," the supervisor began, his voice sincere, but also aware that at least 3 passengers were still recording. "This is not representative of our airline's values or training." The CEO looked at the supervisor thoughtfully. Years of facing similar situations had taught him that these moments could go one of 2 ways. They could end in anger and public embarrassment for everyone involved, or they could become opportunities for real change. He had always chosen the latter. A passenger who had been typing furiously on his laptop raised his hand slightly. "I'm a reporter for the Daily Business Journal," he said. "Would you be willing to comment on what just happened here?" Several other passengers leaned in, curious about how the CEO would respond to this opportunity to publicly shame the airline. Instead of anger or revenge, the CEO saw something different: a chance to transform an ugly moment into something meaningful. He smiled slightly, remembering a similar incident from his early days in business, before his company had made him a recognized name in the tech world. "Actually," he said, addressing both the reporter and the hovering airline staff, "I'd like to propose something constructive." He pulled out his business card and handed it to the supervisor. "I believe my company's training division might have something valuable to offer your airline." The supervisor's eyebrows rose with interest. The flight attendant who had caused the initial problem stood slightly behind him, her earlier arrogance replaced by a mix of shame and curiosity. Other crew members gathered at the edges of the first-class cabin, drawn to the unexpected turn of events. "Our company recently developed a comprehensive training program on unconscious bias in customer service," the CEO continued. "We'd be happy to share our resources with your airline. Sometimes, these uncomfortable moments can become powerful learning opportunities." The cabin fell silent again, but this time it was different. The tension had been replaced by something else: respect, admiration, maybe even a touch of awe. The passengers who had been recording on their phones slowly lowered them, realizing they were witnessing something more meaningful than a viral moment of public shaming. The young tech professional across the aisle smiled broadly. "Now that's what I call turning lemons into lemonade," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. A few passengers chuckled, and the atmosphere in the cabin began to shift from tense to hopeful. The CEO's response had shifted the entire mood of the first-class cabin. Instead of reaching for his phone to blast the airline on social media or demanding the flight attendant's job, he was doing something entirely unexpected. He was choosing to turn this humiliating moment into an opportunity for positive change. Taking out his laptop, he pulled up his company's website and turned the screen so the supervisor could see it. The page displayed their latest initiative, a groundbreaking program that had already helped several major corporations transform their workplace culture. The supervisor's eyes widened as he scrolled through the impressive client list and testimonials. "Our training program isn't about pointing fingers or making people feel guilty," the CEO explained, his voice warm but professional. "It's about understanding how our unconscious assumptions affect our daily interactions." Several passengers who had been listening intently nodded in agreement. The flight attendant who had caused the initial problem slowly stepped forward from behind her supervisor. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. I never meant to," she began, but couldn't quite find the right words to continue. The CEO raised his hand gently, stopping her mid-sentence. "I know," he said simply. "That's exactly why these training programs are so important. We all have biases we don't recognize in ourselves. His words weren't accusatory. They were an invitation to learn and grow. A businesswoman sitting nearby closed her laptop and leaned forward. I'd be interested in learning more about this program for my company too, she said. What happened here today? I've seen similar situations in our customer service department. The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed completely. What had started as an ugly display of prejudice was turning into an impromptu business meeting at 30,000 feet. The reporter who had been typing earlier raised his hand again. This is a much better story than what I originally thought I'd be writing, he admitted with a smile. Would you be willing to talk more about how companies can turn negative incidents into opportunities for growth? The CEO agreed, but added thoughtfully, the real story isn't about me or even this particular incident. It's about how we choose to respond when we face discrimination or prejudice. We can either let these moments divide us further, or we can use them to bring about real change. The supervisor, who had been listening intently, pulled out his own phone and started taking notes. Our airline has been looking to update our training programs, he explained. Something like this, focusing on practical solutions rather than just theoretical discussions, could be exactly what we need. Meanwhile, other passengers had started sharing their own stories in hushed voices. A woman described how her accent had led to similar assumptions about her position in her company. An older gentleman talked about how his age had caused people to underestimate his tech knowledge. The flight attendant, still standing nearby, had tears in her eyes. But they weren't tears of shame anymore. They were tears of realization. The CEO's response had given her something she didn't expect. A chance to learn and grow from her mistake rather than just being punished for it. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the CEO opened his email to draft a quick message to his training team. He knew that what had started as an unpleasant confrontation could become something much more significant, a catalyst for change that could affect thousands of future travelers and employees. The young tech professional across the aisle caught his attention again. You know, he said quietly, I was ready to post this whole thing online, but you've shown a much better way to handle these situations. It's easy to shame people on social media. It's harder to actually solve the underlying problems. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the story of what had happened in first class spread throughout the aircraft like wildfire. Flight attendants whispered about it during their service rounds, and passengers who had witnessed the scene were sharing it in real time through text messages and social media. The young tech professional who had supported the CEO earlier walked over during a quiet moment. My company develops customer service software, he explained, pulling up a presentation on his tablet. We've been looking for ways to incorporate sensitivity training into our programs, but we couldn't find the right approach. What you did today, that's exactly the kind of real-world example we need. Other passengers began sharing their contact information, forming an impromptu network of professionals who wanted to be part of this unexpected movement. A woman who ran a chain of hotels asked about implementing similar training for her staff. An education administrator thought about how these lessons could help in schools. The flight attendant who had caused the initial confrontation was now handling her duties with a noticeably different attitude. Each time she passed through the cabin, her face showed the internal struggle of someone processing a profound realization. During a quiet moment, she stopped at the CEO's seat. I've been doing this job for 20 years, she said softly, her voice heavy with emotion. I always prided myself on being professional, on maintaining standards. But today made me realize that what I thought was maintaining standards was really just prejudice in disguise. The CEO listened thoughtfully, noting how the other passengers nearby had gone quiet to hear the conversation. You know what's interesting? He replied. In my company, we've found that the strongest leaders are often the ones who can admit when they're wrong and learn from it. The supervisor, who had been monitoring the situation, approached with an iPad. Sir, I've been in touch with our corporate office. They're very interested in your training program. Would you be willing to meet with our executive team next week? A ripple of approval went through the cabin. The reporter, who had been documenting everything, raised his hand again. "This is incredible," he said. "You've literally turned a discriminatory incident into a corporate partnership during a single flight. Would you mind if I wrote about this for our leadership section?" The CEO smiled but shook his head slightly. "The story shouldn't be about me," he explained. "It should be about how one difficult moment can spark real change if we handle it the right way. About how we can choose education over anger, growth over punishment." As if to prove his point, another passenger spoke up, an older businessman who had been quietly observing everything. "I've been in business for 40 years, he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "I've seen too many people respond to discrimination with lawsuits and social media campaigns. What you're doing here, this could actually change things from the inside out." The flight attendant, who had been listening nearby, stepped forward again. "I'd like to be part of that change," she said firmly. "If you do create a training program with our airline, I want to help." "My mistake. Maybe it can help other people learn without having to make the same one." The cabin had become more than just a section of an airplane. It had transformed into a space where real change was taking shape. People who had started the flight as strangers were now exchanging ideas about how to make their own workplaces more inclusive. The tech professional returned to his seat, but not before sharing one last thought. "You know what's amazing?" he said. "When I started recording this on my phone, I thought I was capturing a scandal. Instead, I ended up recording something much more powerful. A masterclass in leadership and transforming conflict into opportunity." 2 weeks after the flight, the CEO walked into the airline's corporate headquarters. The lobby was buzzing with energy as employees whispered and pointed. The video of the incident had spread through the company's internal channels, and everyone knew why he was there. He wasn't alone. Walking beside him was the flight attendant from that day who had volunteered to be part of this meeting. Her uniform was as crisp as ever, but her demeanor had changed. Gone was the condescending attitude, replaced by a determined look of someone ready to make things right. The meeting room was packed. Airline executives sat around a large table, while other staff members lined the walls. The young tech professional from the flight was there too. His software company had been invited to help develop the digital training tools. "Before we start," the CEO began, setting down his laptop, "I want to make something clear. This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame. This is about making real, lasting change." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of everyone present. Some nodded, others took notes, but all were focused intently on his words. The flight attendant stood up next, her voice slightly shaky, but growing stronger as she spoke. "I've served on planes for 2 decades, she said. "I thought I treated everyone equally, but that day showed me something about myself that I didn't want to see. And now, I want to help others see it too." A PowerPoint presentation flickered to life on the screen, showing statistics about customer complaints, implicit bias, and lost business opportunities. But this wasn't just another corporate training program. The CEO had done something different. He'd woven real stories throughout the data. "We've collected experiences from thousands of travelers," he explained, clicking through slides. "People who were questioned at hotel check-ins, stopped in store parking lots, questioned in first-class lounges. But here's the interesting part. We also interviewed the employees who made those assumptions. Many of them had no idea they were acting on bias." The airline's CEO leaned forward, clearly impressed. "This isn't like any training program I've seen before," he admitted. "Most focus on rules and regulations. This makes people think about their own actions." They played a clip from the flight, not the confrontation, but what happened after. The moment of understanding, the conversations that followed, the way passengers and crew came together to discuss change. Several people in the room wiped away tears. "Here's what we propose," the CEO continued, "a 3-part program. First, we use real situations, like what happened on that flight, to help people recognize their own biases. Second, We provide tools to help them make better decisions in the moment. And third, we create a system where mistakes become opportunities for growth, not just punishment. The flight attendant stepped forward again. I want to be one of the trainers, she said firmly. Who better to talk about changing perspectives than someone who had to change their own? The room burst into applause. The airline executives huddled together, discussing quietly. The head of human resources was already taking notes about implementation. The tech professional started sketching ideas for an app that could support the training. One more thing, the CEO added, his voice gentle but firm. This isn't just about race. It's about all the ways we make assumptions about people. Their age, their appearance, their accent, their abilities. Real change means looking at all of it. As the meeting continued, people who had come in expecting a standard corporate training presentation realized they were witnessing something much more significant. This wasn't just about avoiding bad publicity or legal problems. This was about changing hearts and minds, one person at a time. Outside the conference room, employees gathered around a TV in the break room, watching a news report about the upcoming partnership. See, one said to another. Sometimes the best things come from the worst moments. The next month flew by in a whirlwind of activity. The airline's training center had been transformed into a hub of change. Today was special. It was the first official session of the new training program, and the room was packed with flight attendants, gate agents, and other airline staff. The flight attendant from that fateful day stood at the front of the room, no longer in her airline uniform, but wearing a professional blazer with a trainer's badge. Her hands trembled slightly as she arranged her notes, but her voice was steady when she began to speak. A month ago, I was the example of what not to do, she said, earning a few nervous chuckles from the audience. Today, I'm here to help make sure what I did never happens again. She clicked to the first slide, showing the video that had now been viewed millions of times online. The CEO sat quietly in the back of the room, watching as she shared her story. He noticed how the audience leaned forward in their seats, captured by the raw honesty in her voice. This wasn't a scripted corporate presentation. This was real, emotional, and powerful. The hardest part wasn't facing my supervisors, she continued, her voice catching slightly. It was facing myself in the mirror that night, realizing that despite all my years of service, despite thinking I treated everyone equally, I had let unconscious bias cloud my judgment. A young gate agent raised his hand. But how do we know when we're acting on bias? He asked. Sometimes it feels like we're just doing our jobs, following procedures. The flight attendant smiled. That's exactly what I thought too, she replied. But let me show you something. She played clips from security cameras showing various passenger interactions. Watch how differently we sometimes treat people without even realizing it. The room grew quiet as they watched. Small differences in tone, in body language, in the level of scrutiny applied to different passengers. It was subtle, but undeniable. Many people in the room shifted uncomfortably, recognizing their own behaviors on screen. The tech professional from the flight had also joined the session. He demonstrated a new app his company had developed specifically for the airline. This tool lets you practice real-world scenarios, he explained. But more importantly, it helps you recognize your own patterns of behavior. During the lunch break, staff members gathered in small groups, sharing their own stories and revelations. A senior flight attendant admitted she often made assumptions about passengers based on their clothes. A gate agent talked about how he treated passengers with accents differently without realizing it. The CEO joined one of these conversations, listening more than speaking. He heard genuine desire for change, saw real understanding dawning in people's eyes. This wasn't just another mandatory training session. This was the beginning of a cultural shift. Back in the training room, the flight attendant shared something unexpected. You know what the CEO taught me that day? She said. That our worst moments can become our best teaching tools. He could have had me fired. Instead, he showed all of us, a better way forward. As the session wrapped up, participants weren't rushing to leave like they usually did after training. They lingered, talking, exchanging contact information, making plans to share what they'd learned with their colleagues. The airline's HR director pulled the CEO aside. "We've done diversity training before," she admitted. "But this is different. People aren't just learning about bias. They're understanding it, feeling it, wanting to change it." The flight attendant's final words to the group summed up the day perfectly. "Remember, every interaction is a chance to either reinforce old biases or create new understanding. The choice is ours, every single time." 6 months had passed since that memorable flight, and the changes were impossible to ignore. The airline's training program had become a model for the entire industry. Today, the CEO stood on a different stage, this time at a major business conference, with hundreds of corporate leaders eager to hear the story. The huge screen behind him showed familiar faces: the flight attendant, now a respected corporate trainer; the tech professional, whose bias recognition app had won innovation awards; and dozens of airline employees whose lives and perspectives had been transformed by the program. "The numbers tell one story," the CEO said, pointing to the statistics on the screen. Customer complaints were down by 40%. Employee satisfaction had risen dramatically. The airline's reputation scores had reached all-time highs. "But the real story isn't in these numbers," he continued. "It's in the lives that have changed." He played a video clip of a recent incident at one of the airline's busiest terminals. A gate agent caught herself making assumptions about a passenger, stopped herself mid-sentence, and corrected her approach. The passenger, who had been filming expecting another viral moment of bias, instead captured a moment of real change. In the audience, business leaders leaned forward in their seats. Some took notes, others nodded in recognition. They'd all faced similar challenges in their own companies, but few had found effective solutions. "The key was making it personal," the CEO explained. "We didn't just tell people their behavior was wrong. We helped them understand why they acted that way, and then gave them tools to do better." He clicked to the next slide, showing the training center full of engaged employees. The flight attendant from that original incident joined him on stage. The audience murmured. Many recognized her from the viral video. But she stood tall, confident in her role as part of the solution rather than the problem. "I could have lost my job that day," she said into the microphone. "Instead, I found my true calling. In the past 6 months, I've trained over 3,000 airline employees. But more importantly, I've helped them see what I finally saw, that we all have biases, but we all have the power to change." The tech professional stepped up next, demonstrating how his app had evolved based on real employee feedback. "We've added features that let users record their own interactions and analyze them later," he explained. "It's like having a personal bias coach in your pocket." From the back of the conference hall, a hand shot up. "But what about costs?" a skeptical CEO asked. "Training programs, new technology. This must have been expensive." The CEO smiled. "Let me show you something interesting," he said, pulling up a new slide. "Yes, we invested in change. But look at what we saved. Fewer customer complaints, meaning less legal exposure, better employee retention, improved brand reputation. This wasn't just the right thing to do. It was smart business." Another video played, showing interviews with airline staff. A baggage handler talked about how the training changed how he treated customers' belongings. A ticket agent shared how she caught herself making assumptions about passengers' ability to afford first-class tickets. Each story showed real people making real changes. "But here's what really matters," the CEO said, his voice softening. "Every person who goes through this program takes these lessons home. They share them with their families, their friends, their communities. We're not just changing an airline, we're changing lives." The applause was immediate and thunderous. Business leaders lined up at the microphones, eager to learn more. How could they implement similar programs? What obstacles should they expect? How had they gotten buy-in from resistant employees? 1 year to the day after that fateful flight, a special ceremony was taking place in the airline's headquarters. The room was packed with employees, media representatives, and business leaders from across the country. The atmosphere buzzed with excitement as people shared stories of how much had changed in just 12 months. The CEO stood at the podium, looking out at the faces of people who had been part of this remarkable journey. The flight attendant sat in the front row, no longer the person who had made a terrible mistake, but a celebrated changemaker who had helped transform an entire industry. When I boarded that plane a year ago, the CEO began, I never imagined I'd be standing here today. We're not just celebrating numbers, though they're impressive. A 70% reduction in bias-related complaints, over 20,000 employees trained, and partnerships with 15 other major companies. He paused, letting those statistics sink in. But what we're really celebrating is something much more powerful: the courage to change. The courage to look at ourselves honestly and say, we can do better. On the screens around the room, images began to play. A young flight attendant catching herself before making assumptions about a passenger seat assignment. A gate agent taking extra time to make elderly travelers feel comfortable. Ground crew members treating everyone's luggage with equal care, regardless of class of service. The tech professional stood up to share the latest data from his app, which had now been downloaded by over 100,000 airline employees worldwide. People are using it not just at work, he explained, but in their daily lives. They're becoming more aware of their thoughts and actions everywhere they go. A surprise guest took the stage, the reporter who had witnessed everything on that original flight. I thought I was going to write a story of discrimination, he said. Instead, I got to document one of the most significant corporate transformations I've ever seen. The flight attendant's turn to speak brought tears to many eyes. Last year, I was the villain in a viral video, she said, her voice strong and clear. Today, I'm proud to say I've helped train thousands of people to recognize and overcome their biases. My mistake became a mission. The airline's CEO stepped forward to make a major announcement. The training program was being made available, free of charge, to any company that wanted to implement it. This isn't about competitive advantage, he explained. It's about making the world a little bit better, one interaction at a time. From the back of the room, the elderly passenger who had witnessed the original incident on the plane stood up. I fly every week, he said. And I can tell you, the difference in how people are treated now is like night and day. This isn't just corporate talk, this is real change. The ceremony concluded with the launch of a new initiative, a scholarship program for students interested in studying corporate ethics and inclusive leadership. This way, the CEO explained, the changes we've made will continue to grow and evolve long after we're gone. As people mingled afterward, sharing stories and experiences, the flight attendant found herself standing next to the CEO. You know, she said quietly, you could have ruined my life that day. Instead, you helped me find my purpose. The CEO smiled, watching as more people gathered around to share their own stories of transformation. That's the thing about change, he replied. Sometimes it starts with one person choosing to see the best in others, even when they're at their worst. As the event wound down, a young employee raised her hand with one final question. What's next? The CEO's answer captured the spirit of everything they'd accomplished. This isn't the end of the story, it's just the beginning. Real change never stops growing.